Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second to last critique. I hope everyone's doing well. I know that a lot of things came up for a lot of people this week, so we're kind of consolidating group A and B into one session. A few people had to drop the critiques for the last 2 weeks because they had personal stuff come up, so I just wanted to let everyone know that's what's going on here. How's everyone doing? And just let me know in the chat box if I'm coming through okay. Hi, Beth. Hi, Susan. All right, guys. Does anybody, before we get started, does anyone have any questions about what we're doing next week? Or even some of the new content this week? There are, and also a bonus video. I did one just showing with the Asaro head how I would go about lighting a model using color gels, because I know some of you guys were interested in using that, buying some color gels and experimenting. So I just use my Asaro head as a model and gave kind of just an example of how I would maybe think about a concept for a painting and then create that effect with lighting artificially in the studio. So that's kind of how I tend to work. Even though I tend to paint my subjects in a landscape, it's a lot of invented kind of composition. So I bring my model into the studio and artificially light them. It's kind of like plein air painting. You don't know what you're going to encounter, and you have a lot less control over the lighting. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to show that, just how you can do it really inexpensive too. You don't have to have a bunch of fancy photography lights or anything. I just showed how to do it with some little clip lights from the hardware store, and you can get some pretty cool effects. So any questions before we jump in? All right. Well, Susan, we're going to go ahead and start with you. And you actually had a really good question. So I kind of did a screenshot of your email question, and I'm going to share it with everyone because I think it's a pretty good one regarding especially the dark skin tone. And you're doing yours in pastel, but I don't mind critiquing it. That's perfectly fine. I know a lot of you have run out of time, and it's the principles behind whether you're doing pastel or oil actually are very similar in terms of color and your like layering. So you just mentioned that you wanted to do this in pastel because you were struggling with the oil paint. And so far you've kind of concentrated on the upper half of the face, and that's fine. Let's see. The blue's making her look metallic. So your question was how to create that blue effect light without it looking like metal. And I can see what you mean there. There's a few reasons it starts to feel kind of metallic, and even in my painting, I would say it kind of takes that on a little bit. Part of that is the edges and the value of her skin. So let's start with the value of her skin. She is a darker skin model, and you will notice if you look at the other photo references, let's say the fair skin model. Here, I'll bring that up because someone did that one. Here you go. So we have Jenny's here. And you can see how the fair skin model, she doesn't have that quite that metallic feeling on that light side, the blue side of the face. So part of that is because of the model's kind of inherent skin tone. Her value tends to reflect that blue differently than the fair skin tone. So it creates a more shimmery effect. Some of that also is the direction of the light source, it being kind of centered, and some of the contrast. So one of the ways you can do that, Susan, is to look at some of the contrast and the edges from that highlight kind of moving over. So when we're painting like a metallic object, what happens is usually, like, let's say you're painting a metal vase. Let me grab some brushes here. You end up with a pretty sharp, let me try grabbing just an ink brush here real quick so I can just draw. So you have like the highlight, right? And let's just pretend this is a metal vase. You usually end up with a very sharp edged highlight, and then suddenly it rapidly goes to dark. And it does that usually on both sides, even though there might be more of a shadow, like a defined shadow edge on a vase or like on some kind of metallic object. What happens is that its majority of it is dark, and then you have this central highlight. So that's kind of what's happening here. And when you're painting it in skin tones, it tends to read a little better. But when we're painting it with, you know, this blue, it can be a little bit jarring. Now, I would wait until you have the rest of the face blocked out before you go back in with a second layer, and kind of adjust things. Just like I did with my painting. So bring it all kind of up to this level, all the way down the face, and then go back in and adjust some edges. And what I would suggest for that second layer is to take, I think I'll do, let me find something that'll imitate your pastel a little bit better. So what I would do is make sure that when you transition to this value on the left side, maybe go like one step lighter. So you could even, oh, that was way too big. Hold on, guys. I get my bearings here. So I would go in and just soften that left side out a little bit more. Maybe broaden the light shape a little bit. And you might even do the same here at the top of the forehead, so it doesn't round so quickly. And then you can take that highlight and actually even push it just a little bit further, a little bit brighter. Just make her highlights a little bit more diffused. I did that in my painting as well because I felt like it was a little bit of a hard edge. And, you know, sometimes that's just what happens. It depends on the person's skin. Some people have really tight skin across the forehead and it ends up really shiny. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just if it kind of hinders the illusion in your painting, people tend to accept photography as it is. You know, even if it's kind of this weird tangent or something like that, we tend to accept it. But if it's a drawing or a painting, your viewer's eye is going to be drawn to that, and they'll think it's an error on your part. And that's just kind of the nature of painting and drawing. So what I do typically is kind of idealize a little bit, and try to make the best painting, right? So even if it's not a copy of the photograph, I try to enhance what works in the photograph, and omit what doesn't work. That way my painting comes together. So you can see that that difference there, just broadening the light on her forehead, made a big difference. So I think also just when you go in and you have the rest of this blocked out, it's going to feel more consistent. It's always a little awkward when you start a painting, kind of doing form modeling in this level of detail, and you'll get halfway through and you'll wonder if it's working or not. That's one of the reasons I encourage everyone to block out even in more broad terms in the beginning. And there's nothing wrong with working this way. This is a valid way to work. I often actually do this myself. I do form painting and it's kind of looking more finished as I move down. But it takes a lot of experience and concentration to make sure everything balances out in the end. So I would still recommend before you go back in and refine that forehead, go all the way down, you know, and get your blue kind of roughly blocked in, like how you did in the forehead. And then then go over and finish out, you can do the red simultaneously. What I found in my piece was that the red needed to be pushed a little bit darker. So I started my painting off with a glaze to kind of knock that red down a little bit. So that might be something that you find you need to do as well, Susan. So because when you squint, it can be hard when you're working with such intense chromatic colors to lose sight. It's really easy to lose sight of the value structure. And if you took the photograph of the model, here I'll show you. If we took the photograph of the model and we took out the saturation, so that we just removed the color, we didn't manipulate the photo any further, you can see how that red is a dark, technically a shadow value. Excuse me. So you can see how there's a value difference between here, which is her cheek, and here, which is in the shadow. And you can see that almost matches the background value. And it's really easy when we're doing reds. Let me take your picture here now and take out the saturation. It's very easy to kind of lose sight of that. So let me take away my blue here. So just remember to keep that in mind as you're applying your colors. So you're saying you find with pastel you have to go in hot so that it'll come through after glazing on top. Yeah, it's very similar to oil painting. My red was a little more on the intense side as well in that first color pass, and that's fine because you're just establishing parameters. You're trying to say, here is my, you're keying your painting. We talk about that a little bit. So you're saying this is my darkest dark, here's my lightest light. You're kind of establishing the chroma relationship. And it helps though to kind of keep in mind, I would say that these reds are a little less intense than the chroma you get in some of the blues. It depends on the area, because obviously the lighter the value, the more or the less chromatic it is. But you can see that hers are very much like in these kind of rusty earth browns, with the exception when you get like right here in the cheek where it starts to turn towards that kind of orange, which I think you're pretty much on that color. Maybe it's a little bit bright, but that could be because your paper starting off is on the lighter side. And that's fine. Glazing it down afterwards, I would just, again, continue to establish, what the rest of the painting, and then go back in and you can easily tone these areas down. So let's just to help you kind of keep something in mind as you progress, let's do just a few color samples. And I'll just do that flat brush there. I feel like you're pretty good with your blue as far as like the value goes for that brightest highlight. Now it can be really hard to get that chromatic of a color, right? When you're working with a set of colors like pastels, or even in oil paint. I mean, I use my phthalo turquoise, which is probably one of the more chromatic, intense colors that I have on my palette, and I still couldn't get quite the chromatic intensity that I see in the photo. However, the relationship between the red and the blue can enhance that. So sometimes the pigments we have out of our tube or whatever we can mix can't be a perfect match just because of the nature of pigment, right? But and that particular pigment's behavior. However, you can still artificially kind of create the illusion in your painting of that intensity a couple of ways. And one of the ways is just by paying very close attention to the chroma in the colors adjacent. So like looking here, and these colors here, they go very gray very quickly compared to that chromatic blue. So long as your colors adjacent are kind of less chromatic, like here in the forehead, put this right here. You can see how it goes very, very gray of a blue right after this really, really intense blue. So you could, and I think you're doing that just fine. Like I can see that this is more gray even than that teal. If you're wanting a little more intensity there, you could try finding a specific pastel. I'm not 100. If this was an oil paint, I would say take a transparent, take your phthalo turquoise and glaze that highlight at the very end to get that chromatic intensity. But I even in my painting, I didn't feel that was 100% necessary towards the end because I felt like the red and the blue kind of balanced each other out. Does that make sense so far? So I just want to compare here real quick. That red in her cheek and the one you're using, I'm going to just kind of favor the darker one. So you can see that you're going to probably need to push that value down a little bit more. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, and that's going to make a big difference. And I ended up doing that in my painting too. You'll see in the demo how I had glazed the blue and then I painted back into it with the scumbling. And I really kind of broadened that highlight more than the photo because I wanted to prevent that metallic feeling as well. The trick is making sure she still feels like she has darker skin, which, you know, so long as you have some of these darker values, it shouldn't be a problem. So just as you continue, just keep that in mind, mostly that those reds might need to be kind of toned down a little bit darker, especially think about where the plane changes are in her face. For example, so the red light is actually coming from a slightly lower to a kind of parallel angle. I don't remember the exact setup because I was kind of moving lights around in different positions, but I think it's kind of like this. And what makes me say that is that her highlight is sitting here, and it tends to sit like on any plane it sits like kind of in the middle of that form there as well. But you'll notice like as this rounds up, just before you have the volume of the area below the eyelid, you'll notice that it gets a little bit darker in that plane, and as it rounds up it gets a little bit darker. So just pay attention to some of those subtle plane changes. That's going to make a big difference in the feeling of the form here. And I realize you just put in like a basic color to start, and you'll be going in and refining that later. So that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions apart from that metallic part? You will find also like up here in the forehead, it's kind of an interesting thing that's happening. You almost see these spots of gray, kind of lavender, gray, blue, and then it slowly gets more orange as it moves down. So you might find yourself wanting to go in here a little bit with a glaze of some of this darker gray or maybe some of the purple, and just carry it down this way just a little bit more. Let me make that darker so you can see. Just gradually. So it should like gradate very slowly, and then it picks up that more intense orange down here. And that's going to help that forehead not jump out so much as well. That's actually something that's making her feel a little more metallic as well, because what happens with metallic objects is the reflections are much more intense within the shadow. So you'll get like this hard core shadow, and then suddenly it gets really, really light. Whereas on skin, it tends to roll more and be more diffused as it comes down. So you might try going in. Let me do it with a pastel, and let's see if it helps. So like if I took maybe a little bit of Yeah, maybe a little bit of that one, and just maybe even a little bit of blue, and just diffuse that orange. Just as it moves gradually. And maybe even going in with, when your orange is in here, make it a little bit more dull and dark as it rolls up. And you might be able to push that blue to the right just a little bit more, so it doesn't have that real hard line like through that core. You have a nice orange in there. It might take like a little bit of layering back and forth and play with it, but you can see how that makes it feel a little less metallic as well. Alrighty. Okay, that sounds good. I look forward to seeing this develop. I've seen some of your other pastel work, so I'm looking forward to it. And the principles like between pastel and oil are actually quite similar. Obviously, there's like a technique that's different, but you still think in layers and glazing and you know, kind of layering specific colors. You're just not doing color mixing in the same way where we pre-mix our values. All right, Jenny. Let me know, Jenny, if your painting feels a little bright in the compared to how it feels in real life. I realize there's a little bit of glare up here at the top, but just let me know where the values sit. Okay, so let's see. Let me catch up on your question here, Jenny. So your question is, can you keep a painterly look when doing numerous color passes, or does it have to be blended? The technique I show is blended, but absolutely you can keep a looser look. Okay, let me darken it real quick. Let me start just with the brightness here. Actually, what about the saturation in the color? Does that seem pretty good? Let me try bringing the curves down just a little bit. Okay, so whether you are painting looser or a more classical kind of blended approach, it almost doesn't matter because the principles behind both styles is the same. So when we talk about shapes, values, edges, tiling, you know, that sort of thing, those techniques and principles also exist in more of like an alla prima approach, or even if you do, you know, work in multiple layers. And actually most alla prima painters, when they work larger, they spend more than one session on the painting, obviously, because it takes more time. And they still maintain that looser kind of look. The key is to think about the planes that you're painting and transitions. So transitions exist, you know, edges, softer edges, harder edges, they still exist whether you're going to be blending or not. So I'll give you an example. So let's talk about the edge here in her cheek. There is a much softer edge where this highlight sits here, and as it rounds to that core shadow, and then before we hit that light with the blue. So to create those transitions, let me grab a brush here. Let me see how that brush works. Let me find a good one that'll kind of imitate the technique that you're wanting. Okay, so let's say you're going to go back in and paint. All you have to do is think about it as adding smaller and smaller shapes. So we start off with these broad masses. We have this broad dark or light mass, and we have this broad dark mass. Now what you want to do is look for smaller and smaller tiles that help create a more subtle transition between those areas. So for example, maybe finding a value that sits in between, right? And you can still use, and one thing that helps to maintain a little bit of a looser approach is to use a brush that's slightly bigger than what you're comfortable with for that area, because it forces you to learn how to wield your brush properly, and also you don't get into the little nitty-gritty details. They're harder to blend with, so you're kind of resisting that temptation to blend. So for example, you could add, you know, a couple of strokes of that color, a couple of strokes of the next one. And her face does need to go a little bit darker on that that orange side. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But even if you wanted to transition to what you have here existing, you'd find a color that's somewhere in between and continue to tile just smaller and smaller shapes, essentially. Pay attention to where planes change, because that's where you're going to get kind of a more dramatic adjustment. And also change your brush stroke direction according to the planes. So if we go in here, and maybe I'll find something kind of in here. So you can see what I'm doing, and where those shapes kind of interlock, you can find a different direction for that brush stroke. I just tend to try and follow the forms. So don't just make random brush strokes, but think about the structure and planes in that face. And you can even go cross contour, meaning across the contour rather than with it, if that makes sense. So you're thinking about the background, it isn't as purple, it's more like the photo. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to worry about that too much. Backgrounds are really easy to change, and usually I find that I want to go back in, and I usually make adjustments to the background even after I'm done with the portrait. I'll go in and kind of tweak it. I didn't with my demo just because of time. It's already a lot of video to watch for you guys, but you can always go back in and add more kind of neutrals, break up the background a little bit more. Yes, I mean, if you're going to paint the face, you know, with a little bit more of a loose approach, then you definitely want to pay attention to how you treat the rest of the painting. So if you're, and it's okay that you blended this out, you're just going to go back in and maybe restate some brush strokes and use a larger brush. And it's also like one of the ways to create kind of a natural vignette. I tend to use value to fade the lower half of my paintings, but you can also use brush strokes, size of brush strokes, to kind of simplify. So for example, going in with a big broad, whoa, that's a little crazy, a bigger, broader brush, you know, to kind of loosen up some of your edges down here. You might want to intensify, but just go like more general and then tighten up a little bit where the details are. I mean, you can look at Sargent for inspiration. He really was great at finding focal point and placing his crispest edges there. So you want your sharp edges and your highest contrast where you want the viewer to look, and everything else kind of fades off. So if you decide to go the other way and you want to blend it out, absolutely it won't be too hard. You will see how to do that in my video, the demonstration. It's a matter of like you can start by glazing, you know, the face down a little bit on that orange side. So you would probably mix, let's say, I would say a little bit of alizarin, a little bit of transparent oxide red. Start with that as a glaze for this light side of the face, or the orange side of the face. And then you can go back in and paint opaquely into that and round out the forms and soften edges. You'll see exactly how I do that, because even mine, after I blended the tiles on my face, they still were a little bit on the kind of jarring side. They needed more refinement. So you'll see exactly how I do that. So let's just do a little bit of comparison of some of the colors. So obviously here we've already kind of talked about that. So you have more of a value that's like this up there, and you're going to want something a little closer to this on that orange side, with the exception of her highlights. But I think even the value you have for the lightest value here is probably just going to need to go down a little bit, and you can see it's not quite as bright as it's kind of deceptive. So starting off with that glaze is going to be really helpful. So that red oxide, and even if that feels too chromatic or rich, you could always throw a tiny bit of blue in there and it'll kind of neutralize it. But starting off with a glaze, I usually use glazes when I really want to shift something in my painting. Like I did it on my red side because I wanted to shift everything darker before I paint it back in. It also just helps you integrate your first and second paint layers so that they feel like they were all painted at once. And I explain that in the videos, so you'll see how that works together. If you kind of squint your eyes at the photo reference here, you can see that the colors in her hair and the values in her hair are a little bit like in relationship to the skin. They're a little closer in value than how yours is painted in. And like I said, it all has to do with probably that lightest value. So by glazing the whole thing down, it'll probably start to put you right in the correct range as far as value goes. Another thing to pay attention to is where the color shifts. So for example, here it should be a blue because it's that blue light, and look at how dark and kind of purpley that is. So, wrong brush, hold on. So if you just kind of tone that a little bit, and just anything that is coming from the left side is going to have that blue cast to it. So same thing down here on the chest, it'll have that blue cast to it. You will find probably once you get this color down a little bit darker, if we just tone that down a little bit, it'll help to integrate some of these values too that you do have correct, like here in the cheek. It just won't feel as abrupt, right? So if you tone that down a little bit, you can see how that's already starting to shift the feeling. Notice her nose is quite dark as well. And even though this feels like it's really, really light, it's still part of what we consider the shadow mass. So pay attention to that. Even these little highlights, they won't get brighter than, you know, these highlights. They're just more abrupt. They kind of jump to that highlight a little bit more quickly. But this is all underplane, and yes, it's getting a little bit of that orange light, But right now, with so much white in the mixture, it starts to feel like it's part of the blue light mass. So just try toning that a little more consistent with the side plane of the nose. And once you do that, you could probably go in and do the same thing, kind of glaze, especially these transitions. Don't be afraid to go a little more chromatic with that blue, especially where it's transitioning from like the shadow side. So any plane that's facing under is going to get a little darker, and that's going to help create that nice richness to the color. So it could be that overall you start off maybe a little light in the orange, and then you really had to push your blue to make it feel bright and intense enough. But once you get that orange a little bit more subdued and darker, you're going to find that that blue is probably a little on the bright side. And that's fine. You'll be able to make that adjustment. It'll be easier for you to judge it once you have that orange in the right kind of value space. Does that make sense? So if we took like that blue that's right before the shadow, let me get the brush. So that blue, and it's really not that chromatic, but it feels super chromatic because of that orange. But if we went in and selected what you have there, even on your darker blue that you have here, I think it could be a little bit on the bright side in value. Does that make sense? And glazing can really help with that. You'll see on the blue side I glazed as well to start off, and then I painted back into it. So that could be helpful for you as well, is to glaze that blue side a little darker, and then you can go back in and paint your lights back into that glaze. It's a very kind of intuitive way to paint back into your work. Do you have any questions? Another thing to watch out for is the whites of the eyes. This eye is lighter than this one, but you can see how quite dark this one gets. And this one is very, very orange, because what's lighting this eyeball is that orange light. So it's going to pick up, it's not going to be as saturated as her skin tone, but it is a little bit more warm. So just kind of push that a little bit more into the warm side, and don't be afraid, just because they're whites of the eyes, don't be afraid to push that value. They are little like spheres, and there's a little bit of orange light hitting there, but that's going to give you a little more depth and volume to the eyes. Okay? All right, good job. I look forward to seeing your painting next week. And I'll send everyone their paint overs too after today. Yeah, I mean, alla prima is a very difficult approach. I mean, it's great for studies and, I mean, as finished works of art as well, 100%. But when you're learning, it can be a lot of pressure to try and get everything to pull together all at once. It's still great practice though. So I always say, just don't put too much pressure on yourself. Enjoy the process, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And then you can go back in and refine your painting, you know, and still keep that loose approach if that's the look you like. That's not difficult to do. It's just a matter of resisting blending and paying attention to more subtle transitions and painting in different tiles. No, alla prima is very much like, I compare it to watercolor painting. It's not as forgiving because it's very easy to lose some of the structure you can overblend, you can get muddy color. You know, you're juggling a lot all at once. And that's one of the reasons I teach the tiling method. It's very structured, and it can feel kind of rigid at first when you're first learning how to do it. And of course, I don't 100% paint that way now, but the principle behind it is to help you keep clean color, to think about value structure, to think about planes of the head. And pretty soon it becomes more intuitive and you can loosen up a little bit. And still you're going to find yourself using those, it's like training wheels in a way. You're going to find yourself loosening up and you're still going to use those tiles, but you might be changing the direction a little bit more. You'll be more confident in your brush strokes. So it's just a matter of practice, mileage, and keep doing those alla prima head studies and leave them tiled. You don't have to blend them out. Alrighty, well, good job. All right, Beth, are you in here, Beth? And you said you wanted to kind of continue from this layer kind of next week, so that's great. Just let me know how the value feels, or if you are, it looks pretty close to me, but just let me know if you need me to do any tweaking before we start, if you're in here. Oh, there you are. I thought I saw you in here earlier. Okay. Yeah, you have a really solid start here. So yeah, it looks pretty close to me, so I didn't think it needed too much adjusting. Yeah, you have a really nice start. So what I would focus on in the next layer is refining some of the transitions, of course, you know, because right now it's in a very tiled state. And so, for example, like even just adding a tile between here and here, you know, finding a color, you can see it has a little more pink to it. So you would just go in and tile another transition there. I would also look for areas where you can maybe enhance some of the pink in her skin, because you do have those olivey kind of undertones that she does have in that yellow undertone. But there are some areas where we could maybe add more variety to that and maybe go and push maybe more of the pink color here in the cheek. And it looks like you could probably go a little bit lighter just in this upper part. It definitely gets more into the dark value as it comes down, but I think that will help to enhance some variety in the skin colors. This color seems really close, so I think you're pretty good there. You might want to put a little more of a pink in the nose too, and that's just a matter of taking the color that you have, which kind of you can see kind of favors a greenish tint. So that's kind of the color you have in the nose for the average value. And let me find something of same value. And you can see that her nose has just a little more red to it. So you might find yourself just wanting to go in and enhance that a touch. And don't be afraid of adding maybe some chroma in that bottom lip where it goes more rosy. You do have those nice violets in her upper lip, but her bottom lip, right where it goes towards that opening of the mouth, I think you could push. Your value seems fine, but maybe just bump up the chroma. You could do that with a simple glaze too. When you go in to repaint the features, you can glaze the lips with a little bit of pink and then paint back into that glaze wet into wet, and that will enhance some of that chroma. I think you have really nice halftones in here. I like that kind of grayish color. Down here, though, she does start to get maybe a little bit more in the purple side on the left side of the face. So maybe start to take some of these colors here on the left under the jaw and go just a little bit more kind of purple with it. She does have more of that green kind of feeling over on this side. So just maybe look at where you could shift that. Let me draw some lines here so that you can see where I'm taking these samples from. So let me get my bearings on where I pulled these colors from. So this was from there. This was from the lip. Do that one in a different color. So that was just the lip there. And then I think this was just the red in the cheek. Just a little bit more red there. And that should really kind of do it. It'd start to pull it together. She might have a little, I can't tell if it's just that you have had a little bit of a shadow kind of cast over your painting, but the values here could probably lighten up at the top of the forehead. So just pay attention to that color there. It's kind of compare those values. I can't tell if it's just the photo making it look darker up there, but you might try and make sure that you're a little bit lighter because her forehead is getting the most light. So we want it to kind of have a little bit more brilliance. And you could probably use another tile somewhere in here to help transition from that darker green. So so I would take maybe this color and that green, maybe you could mix those two together, make it a little bit more pink, and then lay it in right there. So I'll make a note of that here real quick. So, and then I'll make a note about the nose. And that is pretty much what I see. Do you have any questions? They can be questions about anything if you are just wanting to like get suggestions for, I'm focusing on color, but if you want other suggestions for the portrait, just let me know. One thing I will say is to make sure right now the center line for the lip feels a little bit too far back. So you might, if you're going to repaint those lips, just make sure kind of where the center of her nose meets the philtrum. Her center line for her lip was probably going to be somewhere like right there. So you might end up just shifting that shape forward a tiny bit. I think you're okay with this here. It looks like you're really close to the correct position on the left side, so it's just a matter of foreshortening that. You know, I don't use Procreate. What I use Procreate for personally is I will do like composition sketches. Sometimes if I have a photograph, I will do like a little preliminary. I tend to use it when I have commissions and I just need to send them like a couple of concept ideas, like changing background or, you know, those sort of things. I will do that digitally because it's just easier now to do that than on the physical painting. But I don't usually use it to analyze the photo necessarily, but it can be a good tool because sometimes isolating a color can be difficult. And part of the reason for that is there are probably like 15, 20 colors, even just within this like little shift here. The downside to it is that when we're analyzing color with our eyes, we see things more unified, whereas this little color picker, I can move from here to here and I'm not moving very far across the form and I'm getting a drastically different color. So I try to be kind of general when I'm picking out your guys' colors to compare. And I'm talking more in like general terms, like what's closest to the general color for that region. It can get overwhelming if you try to mix every single color you see across this form. It's just because pixel by pixel, there's just so many, different colors to choose from, if that makes sense. It can help in this context. Let's say you start your portrait and you say, I don't feel like I'm nailing the color. Then you could bring it into Procreate and do essentially what I'm doing here and just start making some broad comparisons in the same way. And that can be really useful. Also doing value comparisons. So you could take each image and turn it into black and white using the tools up here, hue and saturation, and you can take out the saturation and then it'll help you see how your value structure is holding up. You could also do that on your phone and just have the black and white photo of the the reference and then of your painting and kind of swipe between the two. That can be also useful. But another thing to think about is if you're working from a different kind of monitor or a print in your studio versus looking at it on your iPad, you might see slight color differences just between the two mediums or different monitors that you're using. I know my monitor at my studio has a little bit more of a greenish yellow cast, and I've calibrated it. It's just it's an older monitor. I noticed that Mac products tend to have much more of a blue light, so it tends to enhance anything that's kind of on the blue side. So those are just kind of things that we have to kind of work around as painters. But it's no different than working from life. If you think about it, you have a model sitting there and there's going to be slight movements. They're not always going to keep their head 100% in the same position, so you have to adapt your drawing, as the model adjusts. And same thing with light. If you're using natural light, the light changes throughout the day. If you're using a skylight or a natural window light on your model, the color and the light is going to shift ever so slightly throughout the day. Or if you're used to doing outdoor painting, it changes really quickly if you're doing a landscape. So those are things that we just have to learn to adapt to as painters, if that makes sense. Okay, so Jenny, you said, can you point to the face now to show us which shades you would choose to paint? Yeah. Okay, so for example, let me just create a new layer here. So what I typically do is I take an average. When I'm looking at something, where I see like a distinction, I'll draw over in white. So when I see a shape, I'm looking at like this shape here, and then there's this shape here. And I would, even though the values are very similar, you can see that there is a slight difference because there's a little reflected light in here, and this is just slightly darker. So those would be like my two colors. Of course, then we also have this shape down here, or this color down here, which is considerably darker. So I would take an average of that one, and that one. And sometimes if it's that slight of a difference between these two, I just start with one color and then go back in and enhance it later in a second pass. So it's easy to overwhelm yourself with trying to mix too many colors. So the next kind of tile area that I would look at would be the transition zone, and I would consider like this a transition zone. Even though there's a slight gradient, but in that small gap of a space, I usually try and find something somewhere in the middle. And then if I start to look at planes and how the plane's changing, I look for color groups like that. And the color starts to shift right around there. into another color here. And then there's that color there. Does that make sense? So there, and then there's, you know, this plane that's broken up into two. So I try to take averages for each of those areas as best as I can. Now you will find common areas where you have this color here, and then you might also find it down here. And so I try to look for where I see the same color in multiple areas, and that's how I decide what colors I'm mixing. It's kind of like looking at details before you block in your painting. The more details you kind of get absorbed into, if you're starting to paint eyelashes before you have the form of the eyelids, you're going to get really frustrated because, or even when you're drawing, if you are focused on drawing the eye, but the eye is not in the right position on the face, then you're going to be unhappy with your work in the end. So the same thing kind of goes with color. You want to take in the overall average skin tone, her overall undertone. You want to keep these things in mind and kind of look at big picture colors before you worry about small colors or smaller shapes or smaller transitions. So what that kind of looks like would be looking at the shadow mass. I would say usually 2 values on average for the shadow mass. Okay, sometimes you'll get 3. It depends on how much reflected light you have. So you might have just one average shadow, and then you have a darker version that you tend to get in other areas, like in the neck or the under the lips. Your midtones, you're probably going to have, well, you have your dark midtones. So what I would consider your darker midtones, that's like this kind of broad area, right? Here's where the shadow ends there. It varies in terms of width, but you have these bigger areas. So I would say that is your dark mid-tone. So dark mid. So it's still considered a light. It's part of the light mass. Okay, so it has some opacity to it. Then you have your average, and this is really simplifying it. So average skin tone, right? And we start to see that here and here. We see it in here. Actually, more like right in here. So it's kind of her average skin tone. And then you have your light mass. And there in the light mass, you have kind of the lighter values, and then you have the highlight value. So this would be a light. It's just a little bit lighter than her average skin tone. And then you have, of course, the highlights. So those are the colors I make sure I have. Even if I don't have every single transition within this area, I tend to mix that as I go along. So if you think about it, you have 2 values here. You probably have 1 to 2 here. You have 1 average skin tone, 1, maybe 2 lights. It depends on the person's skin tone. You know, if they're fair, you're going to have more steps in this area. If she's darker skin, you're going to have more steps in this area. Does that make sense? And that's one of the reasons I wanted us to paint 3 different models with 3 different skin tones. It's not only about color, but also paying attention to, you know, where the more of the mixtures kind of sit. So on darker skin tones, you definitely have more of those. You have more of these. Whereas in fair skin tone, you're going to have more of these. Does that make sense? So I hope that was helpful. I know it's hard to determine, like to make those decisions. Some artists will mix one color for the light mass and one color for the dark mass, and that's what they start with. A great example would be Richard Schmid. When you see him do, and he paints all Prima, but when you see him start his initial sketch, he kind of takes an average skin tone, like that middle kind of average value of the model's skin, and an average shadow value, and he uses washes, and he just washes it in very loosely with that. And then he goes in and tiles in his halftones and, a little more detailed. And highlights, of course, are built on top of that. So you could think of it that way as well. I find that it's a little harder because a lot of times what happens is it's harder for people learning when you're first starting out, because notice how, like, there's almost, with this lighting situation, there's almost this division. Her average values on this side are much darker than they are on this side. So what we're getting is that whole egg shape effect. So if I were to kind of draw, in an oval basic head shape, right? So then we have the cranium back here. And I had to divide this into broad areas. I would say you have this transitioning to this, and then you have this. But obviously there's a lot more going on between here and here. Does that make sense? But we're thinking about that overall, and also actually what's happening is this is coming down in here too, because it's an egg. And then you'd have like a highlight color right down the center of wherever the light's coming from. So thinking of it as like an egg can be helpful as well. Okay, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right. Let me get a drink of water. Is everyone doing okay? All right, so Sapana, she is not in here live, I don't believe, but she decided to do a self-portrait. So I told everyone last week, if you want to do your own photo, that's perfectly fine. So she's working on a self-portrait, and so let's go ahead and get started here. Really nice start. I think what I'm seeing is that maybe you have a little bit more pink in your skin. So what I would do is, in that second layer, really concentrate. You have a great value structure here. Your shadows look to be appropriate value and color. I think the pinks in your skin are much cooler. So you're going to want to pull out that alizarin crimson and really start to utilize some of that. So I'm going to just take a few color samples where I think you can make some changes. And let's start with the lips here. You have a very saturated kind of pink in the lips here, and yours is much more kind of orange and a little bit more muted. Especially when it comes to that highlight, look at how cool. And what's happening, I think, is that you're under you're in the shade somewhat, but you're under natural light. So it really tends to have a cooler color because of the sky. The color of the sky is what's kind of lighting your face. So that makes your highlights a little bit on the cooler side. Even on your nose, the highlight is a little bit more of a bluish white rather than a yellow white. So another area where you can start to bring in a little more pink. Oh, actually, let me compare that highlight color real quick on your lip. I think it needs to go brighter, but also cooler pink. Same thing goes in the nose. Now, we don't always want to paint our own, or even our model's nose as pink, but a little enhancement can really help. So if we look at maybe just like the average color, I just want to compare like two different zones. Let's compare that to the forehead. So you can see that there's a clear color zone there, and you even have a little bit more of that pinkish quality in the cheeks, although it's not as pronounced. But I would say it has a little bit more of a pinkish quality, and it's also a little bit lighter in the cheek area as well. So just pay attention to some of those shifts, and that's going to help a lot with adding some variety to the color. I think you have some of these kind of olive undertones, really, really nice. So it's just a matter of getting those to kind of be complemented by adding in more of the pink. So olive tones are kind of more on the greenish side. So by introducing a little bit of red in there, you're going to actually enhance some of that color. Another thing to pay attention to is those highlight colors. The highlight on the cheek. And even the nose. I think even the nose is even more obvious. It's a kind of a coolish white. And even your brightest is more of a yellow. So you can see that shift trend kind of happening here. Cooler. So this is from the lips. This is from the nose. And then this is the forehead. I think both of these are from the forehead. So actually no, that last one was from the cheek. So that one was from the forehead area. Let me try drawing that into the right spot. So it's like from there, and then that is from the cheek. I'll just make a note of that here for you. This was lips. And then this is the highlight. So I think your shadow color looks good. All the other values and colors look pretty good. Of course, you're going to want to make some of the tiles a little bit more subtle, but I think that should do it. And I'm just going to do a quick paint over so you can kind of see what I mean. How introducing a little bit more of a cool pink into the lips is going to enhance that color. And even in the upper lip, it's a cooler, kind of more purple pink rather than an orange. Where it does get really warm is like right in that crease, so don't be afraid to push that chroma in those dark values, and that really brings a lot of life to the lips. And same thing under here. Look at how chromatic some of the shadows start to get. That tends to happen with natural light. So your darks should have a very kind of rich red-brown. I would enhance that just a little bit more. Don't be afraid to push the chroma a little bit more to the red side in those hollows of especially the dark areas. You might even find yourself wanting to use a little alizarin glaze in there. That could help to add some richness. The nostrils are always a very, very red tone. And just adding a little bit more chroma to those select areas always makes a painting feel a little more lively. And same thing with cooling off those highlights. It's subtle. Actually, that one probably needs to be a little bit brighter. But you can see how it kind of vibrates now off of that yellow. So just try revisiting some of those highlights. Actually, that one on the right side is pretty close. Maybe it even needs to go a little bit darker. Now, one thing just to note for drawing edit is the position that you have that angle change in your jaw. It feels a little kind of short and rounded. You might even need a little more space here. Not by much, but like I feel like your chin should be down here, and this kind of squares off just a little bit more. So just keep that in mind as you make your way into your second color pass. All right, and if you have any follow-up questions, I know you couldn't be here live, just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you another kind of midweek feedback. And actually that goes for everyone. If you're kind of stuck on your painting in the middle of the week, just send me an email and I can give you some written feedback before next Saturday. I'll try and be on top of it this week. I don't have as much. This past week was a little bit up in the air. All right. Really nice job though, and I look forward to seeing it next week. All right, Aaron, I saw you in here. Are you still here with us? Before we get started, just let me know how the photo of your painting is coming across, if it needs to be darkened or anything. It looks pretty close to me. I don't see any real obvious difference. Yeah, you have a really beautiful start, and actually I really love this photo. I think I told you that. It's really nice. I think it's going to make a really beautiful painting. So, all right. Just a few things to note. I think one thing I noticed, like kind of stepping back from your painting or even zooming out and looking at the photo reference, I think you could start to introduce a little more chroma in a few areas of the face and the forehead. So for example, and this is something that is really obvious on children because their skin tones are very fresh. You know, they haven't been exposed to the sun too much, and they tend to have, especially on a fair skin, you tend to see a lot more of those translucent layers, and you get more chroma kind of popping out in certain areas of the skin. So this is a great example of that red zone. You really see that overall color shift right through here, from here to here. I mean, they're two different values, but you see that difference. So let's just take a few color samples just for fun, because I think this is a great opportunity for everyone to see those color zones, because they're not always the most obvious. You see even from the nose to that left cheek, kind of moving across. Very, very kind of pink. If we go up to the forehead, look at how neutral that color is by comparison. And even if we just took like something closer to the shadow edge and did the same thing, kind of moved across the form and even picked up that highlight color on this side, you see how it's a whole shift towards something like more of a gray. And then she has this really obvious gray zone here. And it's a little less obvious on this side, but you can see that it's still kind of a cooler, more neutral pink, and you see it down in here. And the chin picks up a little bit more pink as well, because it kind of goes into this purple. But if you look under, like under here, you get that real rich kind of, well, that one's almost the same color as in the forehead. You get that, which is very similar to that color. And then even moving over into the lights, it goes more pink, but it's a cooler kind of shift. So this is a really great example of those pretty obvious color zones. in the face. And I think that's something you could start to enhance in the second layer. I think the forehead, so let me just make some notes here real quick. And it'll give us a little more room to work. So this is that cheek zone. This is the forehead. And this is the jaw blue zone. So sometimes the forehead comes across as a neutral or / yellow, as we had talked. This one is the red zone. And then this is the blue zone, blue-gray zone. And it doesn't always come across that way, but you can see that even these colors here are more bluish than what we have through the forehead. So I just wanted to point that out. And then looking here, we have something very similar in each of these zones. So what I would do is start by shifting those obvious color zones. So I think, for example, I would go in and take like your cheek color and really add that rosy kind of dusty rose color that she has. And I would say hers favors a little bit more on the cadmium red side than, say, an alizarin. I think you pretty much nailed the lip color, although it could be a little warmer in some areas. Let's make a quick comparison of that. So I'm going to just take like an average. Yeah, yours is a little cooler. You could try enhancing that with a little cad red and white, just to bring that up a little bit more. But I think going in to her cheek area, so that's kind of what you have there, and you can see that shift from her average. Actually, I think this was the left side of the cheek. But even if we took her average, you can see how it shifts a little bit warmer. So let me do a quick paint over. Do you have any questions so far? So I'm going to just go ahead and shift two major zones that I think could use it. Let's start with the forehead, mostly because that forehead feels a little bit on the bright side. So if we start by knocking that down, and even on that lightest little bit over here, and then it maybe give yourself a little bit wider of a transition zone kind of through here. The trick with children is that their forms are so soft and subtle as the color transitions. And you'll notice that this background is directly reflecting into that shadow. So I feel like you have that, but notice how towards the top of the forehead it's picking up more of that influence of that color. So you might even enhance some of the chroma a little bit towards the top, and I would say down actually into. So this is a great example of how the environment influences the skin tones. This time it's happening in the shadow mass. And it does get gradually darker, but I think if you just warmed that up a little bit, it's going to create a lot of interest to and convincing kind of quality to that transition. I feel like your transition here feels pretty good. Maybe it just needs to be a little broader. And then we have this cheek. It's on the other side of the nose, so it's not getting as much light. Same thing kind of happens here. It gets pushed down into a deeper value. And notice it cools off as it kind of pulls back in here. So I would knock that down a little bit, and then you're going to see that color come across the nose as well. And then on this side it starts to pick up a little bit more of like a peachy tone, but again it still has that kind of warmer chromatic pink undertone. So what I would do is take maybe a little bit, what's going to give you a color very similar to that is cadmium red, yellow ochre, and white. Very little bit of blue in there maybe, but for those cheeks you might be okay with that. And notice how it gets very cool right in this transition there. And yes, she does have a little bit more of like a peachy highlight color right through there. When you're handling the hair coming in front of the face, what I would suggest is finding like, well, you can kind of see her skin tone back in here. So what I would do, I know you left it kind of blank, I would take that color there, so I'll do a little sample here for you, but I would fill that in, and it gets darker as it kind of comes up, almost like you're painting what's behind the hair, right? So you can see those areas where it's a little bit more red than her golden hair, and that's how you know it's the skin tone kind of showing through. So I would paint kind of that in, let that set up and kind of dry, and then start painting the hair over the top of it. Okay, so then when we get down into the lower jaw, you do see this enhanced kind of pink in her chin, but notice it's not as warm as what we get through the nose and the cheek. It kind of takes on a little bit of a purple, but it is a little bit darker as well. And then don't be afraid of these cool zones colors. So starting on the left side, you might just push it a little bit more towards that blue-green. There's definitely some blue-gray in this area. And you see it here underneath. And then on this side it starts to kind of take on more of a cool pink. It's not as gray or green, if that makes sense. And because the hair is here, it's actually blocking some light from this little area, so I would just make that a little bit of a darker skin tone than what you place here, because the light should be kind of concentrated right through this area. And then just like I said, enhancing some of that warmth, that peachy tone in her lips. And don't be afraid to go really chromatic in here. Maybe a little bit of alizarin, maybe not so dark, but more rich. Alizarin crimson, maybe a little red oxide, and that's going to really get those areas to feel warmer and pop. Her hair is probably a little bit more on the yellow side, and part of that is the environment that she's in. This color is going to be influencing, you know, all that warm yellow on the wall behind her is coming in. Not to mention there looks like there's some direct sunlight, so it's going to really capture that warmth in her hair. So don't be afraid to push that maybe a little bit more ochre. And yep, that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions? So just looking at pushing those color zones, I would say, and the values, of course, just slightly. You're very welcome. All right, so that is everyone, I believe. So does anyone, let's just open it up to everyone. Does anyone have any questions right now about the critiques next week? So we're going to do the same thing. So those of you who are Group B, because I had a few people have to drop out for personal reasons from the critiques for the last 2 weeks of class, I'm going to go ahead and consolidate everyone into the morning group just to make it easier. So next week, do your best to get it as close to a finish as possible. Of course, I will have suggestions, so you guys are welcome to continue working on them and post in the forum after we're done with critiques. If you want some written feedback leading, out to the end of the class. And I did send out an email letting everyone know that before the end of October, I will send out a link. It's a private link to where you can get lifetime access to all of the course videos. So keep an eye out for that email. It'll be coming out probably in a week or two. That's pretty much it. Any questions? If not, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. All right, thank you, Jenny. Take care. Have a good weekend. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up then. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing all of your guys' work next week. Everyone did a great job, and again, you can reach out to me midweek if you're feeling stuck on your painting and you want some extra guidance, okay? All right, guys. Thank you again. Have a great weekend. Bye.